Mixed reactions to Barack Obama's latest plans on Afghanistan. U.S. troops are to stay, reversing the president's promise to bring them all home. He blames the deteriorating security situation in the war against the Taliban. So, has Obama's Afghan policy failed? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Rob Matheson. His presidential election campaign promised to withdraw all U.S. troops from Afghanistan. Now Taliban fighters are forcing Barack Obama to break his promise and order U.S. troops to remain after he leaves the White House. Now, as more U.S. troops have gone home, Afghan forces have taken over, and so has the Taliban. Fighters seized the Taliban's former stronghold in Kunduz city last month until Afghan troops, with the help of the U.S. airstrikes, forced them out. The embarrassing attack for the Afghan government raises questions about whether Afghan security forces are strong enough to fight off the Taliban on their own. Here's how Obama announced his new strategy.
The bottom line is, in key areas of the country, the security situation is still very fragile. And in some places, there's risk of deterioration. Fortunately, in President Ghani and Chief Executive Abdullah, there is a national unity government that supports a strong partnership with the United States. During their visit earlier this year, President Ghani and I agreed to continue our counterterrorism cooperation. And he has asked for continued support as Afghan forces grow stronger.
Well, that's a very different plan from the one Obama announced 4 years ago.
We will bring home a total of 33,000 troops by next summer, fully recovering the surge I announced at West Point. After this initial reduction, our troops will continue coming home at a steady pace as Afghan security forces move into the lead. Our mission will change from combat to support. By 2014, this process of transition will be complete, and the Afghan people will be responsible for their own security.
Well, things didn't quite work out the way Obama had planned, and the new strategy means extending what is already the U.S.'s longest war. It started in October 2001 when President George W. Bush declared war on al-Qaeda fighters who planned the 9/11 airliner attacks in the United States. The initial U.S. air campaign targeted mainly Taliban troops and training camps. U.S. ground troops began arriving in November 2001. The Taliban government was ousted from the capital Kabul by the end of the year, and the U.S. military presence continued to grow, steadily rising every year to 100,000 troops in August 2010. President Obama announced his withdrawal plan halfway into his first term. Troop numbers have fallen to today's current total of just under 10,000. Well, under the new strategy, the U.S. troops already in Afghanistan will remain there through 2016, and about half of them will stay on for the next year as well. But is a force of 5,500 really capable of bolstering the Afghan army against the Taliban? Well, let's bring in our guests for this show. In Kabul, Sharif Hassan, he's a journalist for The Washington Post. In Amsterdam, via Skype, Bette Dam, author of A Man and a Motorcycle, How Hamid Karzai Came to Power. And joining us from Milan, David Sedney, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Afghanistan, Pakistan and Central Asia. Welcome to you all. David, I'd like to start with you. How strong is the argument that the White House has misjudged when to pull troops out of Afghanistan?
I don't think that's a particularly relevant argument. The president didn't make this all about a timetable of pulling out troops. He made it about a success for Afghanistan. And what's happened over the last 2 years has shown that we were pulling troops out too fast. To his credit, the president has adjusted the policy. And if you read carefully what he said the other day, it was focused on success for Afghanistan, support for the unity government, and support for President Ghani and Chief Executive Officer Abdullah. That, to me, is admirable flexibility. A key thing that he said in his statement was sanctuaries in Pakistan had to end. All of the original planning, which I was part of, was predicated on the idea that sanctuaries in Pakistan would end, and that would help Afghanistan be safer. Unfortunately, the sanctuaries in Pakistan remain. There's been no change. That's probably the biggest single thing that has happened, is the continuation of the sanctuaries in Pakistan.
Sharif Hassan, has the West taken its eye off the ball in Afghanistan, do you think?
I think pulling out all US troops from Afghanistan is a big mistake. That's why President of the United States of America, President Obama, decided not to do it. Afghanistan is in a very critical juncture of time. According to the Long War Journal, around 20% of Afghanistan territory is either under the Taliban control or contested by the Taliban. And also we know that weeks ago Taliban captured the 6th largest Afghan city. So in this very critical juncture of time, I think President Obama did the best choice that he did not he announced the new schedule for the drawdown of US troops from Afghanistan.
Betta Dam, what's your reaction to this decision?
I think the decision of President Obama will not change a lot for Afghanistan. It will extend the conflict. You will soon see more radicalized groups standing up in Afghanistan claiming to be ISIS. As long as this counter-terrorism operation will go on, as long as the American troops will go out in the field and do night raids and attack families. I think from the field of being in Afghanistan for years, living there, I think the conflict is misdiagnosed as a terror conflict, as a military conflict that can be solved by sending more American soldiers to Afghanistan. The real, I think, and much more realistic approach is that there's lots of groups in Afghanistan fighting each other for power, for land, for money, especially for drugs at this moment. That makes it a chessboard with several interests, and that makes it also a political conflict. I think after 9/11, Washington focused mostly on a military strategy, giving the generals a lot of responsibility to solve what's going on the ground in Afghanistan. I think that's been a mistake from the beginning. For example, the Taliban has never been a group that supported the international jihad. It's never had signed any fatwa of Osama bin Laden or Al-Qaeda until today. It's an indigenous movement that comes from Afghanistan, that came from Afghanistan in the 90s when there was a civil war going on, where there was no one else who was able to solve this except the Islamic group, the Taliban. That is all an Afghan game. That is all has to do with a share of power.
I have to interrupt here and say that this is really a mistake. The Taliban were supported by Pakistan, had thousands of Pakistani military advisors. It was partly an indigenous movement, but it was also an effort by Pakistan to counter what it thought was effort by India to take over Afghanistan. I was just in Afghanistan. I spent 10 days there, and I spoke with President Ghani, I spoke with Chief Executive Officer Abdullah, and I spoke with many ordinary Afghans. What Afghans want is not continued war, as your previous speaker talked about. What Afghans want is peace.
Exactly. And I think there is an opportunity for peace. I think the narrative of who is the Taliban has been is not well researched. I think also before 9/11, there was hardly any knowledge in Washington about what the situation on the ground was. The Americans left Afghanistan. They had not one person on the ground. So there was not a direct knowledge of the conflict and who is the Taliban really.
Yes,
but
I
still,
think you're right about what happened 13, 14, 15 years ago. But today we actually understand the Taliban quite well. And as President Obama said in his speech, the big issue is the sanctuaries in Pakistan. I was just at a meeting in Herat, Afghanistan, 8 days ago with Pakistani former generals, with Afghans, and they all agreed that the presence of the Taliban in Pakistan, Mullah Mansour, the new leader of the Taliban, is in Pakistan. He had his crowning ceremony in Quetta in Pakistan. This is something that the Pakistanis need to take care of. The Americans can't take care of it, and the Afghans can't take care of it.
Absolutely. If you would make a picture of all the Afghans who would now be across the border, you would find people who work with Mansour. You would find people who are, like Mansour, involved in drugs deals with the Afghan government. You would find other groups. There's so many groups who have left this current kleptocracy in Kabul who do not have any service for its people anymore. There's so many reasons at the moment to fight the current Afghan government supported by the US forces doing night raids.
Actually, the current Afghan government, led by President Ghani, is committed to reforms. It has very strong support. The strongest support that President Ghani got in his election campaign was by young people, young Afghans.
David, forgive me. I'd like to break in here, if I may. I'd like to come back to Sharif Hassan. Sharif, do you think that because there is obviously a wide breadth of issues to be dealt with in Afghanistan, that the US military's strategy so far needs to change, that it needs, from what Beta was saying, there needs to be a wider process rather than just a purely military one in Afghanistan?
I think, I'm partly agree with Beta, so but the truth is that the truth on the ground is this, that the fighting in Kunduz exposed the weakness of Afghan military. So even though this argument is partially correct, that the continuation of the existence of foreign troops in Afghanistan radicalize Afghan youth, but the problem is this, that we had to do something immediate, like the drawdown of the foreign forces from Afghanistan in immediate future basically means the collapse of this government. So it's like a temporary solution. I'm agree with Beta done partly that the long-term solution is to start genuine peace talks. I mean, Afghan government, Pakistan, Taliban, and any country who are involved in Afghanistan, they have to start a genuine and peace talks and peace negotiations to end this war. We know that, I mean, every war has to end one day.
You say that
Americans,
forgive me for interrupting.
Afghan Western allies cannot pay.
Sharif, forgive me for interrupting. You're saying that the peace process should start now. What has prevented that peace process happening up to this point, in your opinion?
I think even though Taliban always has said that the foreign troops, the existence of foreign troops in Afghanistan is the biggest obstacle for the peace talks. But my understanding, the biggest obstacle to peace talks is this, that Afghan government has always said that they want peace, always said that they want reconciliation, but they are not ready to give up something. As we know, like the cost of getting something, you have to give up something. And basically President Karzai and later President Ghani is telling for the Taliban to accept Afghanistan constitution, to accept the women's right, to accept freedom of expression and everything. So it basically means surrender. It basically means telling for the Taliban to surrender. And the Taliban won't surrender, considering that they have control or they contest around 20% of Afghanistan territory. The big obstacle is this. So Afghan government needs to deal with the peace talks honestly. On the other side of the table, Taliban also Taliban must understand that they cannot enforce their interpretation of Sharia law on the people. They cannot force the people to pray. They cannot force the people to grow beard. So it's like both sides have to show some flexibility. If both sides show some flexibility, then there would be peace talks. And I think then, as President Obama has said, if Taliban came and start a meaningful and genuine peace talks with Afghan government, if both sides, triple sides actually, Pakistan, Taliban, and Afghan government agree on a peace talks, so as President Obama mentioned clearly, then there's no.
Forgive me for interrupting, Sharif, but I want to talk about this much further. But for the moment, the United Nations says last year was the deadliest ever in Afghanistan. 22% rise in civilian deaths took the total to more than 10,000. Despite that, many Afghans are against a prolonged US presence. Here's our Kabul correspondent, Jennifer Glass.
Funeral prayers in Kunduz for a man wounded in the Taliban fighting, but killed in the U.S. airstrike on the Doctors Without Borders hospital. His brother says the U.S. announcement to keep troops in Afghanistan is unwelcome.
We don't need Americans to send their forces here to protect us. We demand that the United States and other foreign countries should stop supporting the Taliban and others who fight us.
At the funeral meal, the sentiment is the same. These residents of Kunduz know Afghanistan's security problems well. Taliban fighters held their city for 3 days. Afghan forces needed U.S. air and ground support to battle them.
Instead of leaving thousands of forces here, the Americans should support and equip our own forces, and they should be equipped with modern weapons.
The United States is helping build an Afghan Air Force, but it takes years to train pilots and technicians. And on the battlefield, the Afghans still rely on U.S. air support.
Afghan President Ashraf Ghani welcomed the American decision to keep troops here and said it came after months of consultation. The Taliban says it will be an expensive war in terms of finances and casualties and called on its fighters to step up attacks on American targets.
In this mosque in Kabul, there's not much hope that a continued American presence, the deteriorating economy and security situation.
People are fleeing the country, and in the past 13 years that America was here, what have they done to help us? And now they keep more troops in Afghanistan. I don't think it'll help. It's for their own interest, not ours.
The mullah of the mosque says the U.S. decision to stay is in part because the Taliban refused to come to the peace table and chose to fight instead.
We should have worked for the peace process, and then there would be no reason for the foreigners to stay in this country.
U.S. forces will be staying at least until 2017 in 4 bases around the country. Many Afghans say they aren't convinced that such a small number of U.S. soldiers can make a real difference in ending the violence here. Jennifer Glass, Al Jazeera, Kabul.
David Sedney, there were 9,800 U.S. troops in Afghanistan, and yet the Taliban was able to take Kunduz. Even if the U.S. stays, how is it going to have to change its strategy to be able to deal with these kind of attacks, plus an impending threat or a suggested imminent threat from Al-Qaeda as well?
Well, as I mentioned before, I was just in Afghanistan and found among many people very strong support for continued presence of U.S. troops there. But what they also want is their ability to have their own air force, as your correspondent mentioned, and a number of other capabilities which take a longer period of time. U.S. troops are not fighting on the ground. The U.S. is providing air support. But the issue the person in Holland mentioned earlier about night raids and stuff, that's long in the past. The bottom line is that the Taliban say that they're fighting against foreign forces. But 2014, foreign forces were reduced by almost 100,000, and 2015 has been the year the Taliban have killed the greatest number of Afghan civilians. So in fact, the Taliban have increased their attacks as foreign forces have gone down. The way forward is, as President Ghani and President Obama have agreed, is to train the Afghan forces. But in many ways, it's a race against time. Can they train the Afghan forces fast enough to handle the onslaught from the Taliban? And I must stress what I said before. As long as an insurgent group has a sanctuary, and the Taliban have a sanctuary in Pakistan, history around the world shows that insurgent groups with sanctuaries have a much higher rate of success. So then the real question becomes, what does Pakistan do? Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif will be in Washington in a couple of weeks, and I'm sure that President Obama will push him on the issue of the Taliban sanctuaries in Pakistan.
Bet Adam, as Sharif was mentioning earlier on, one of the key things will be negotiation longer term. Now, what in your opinion is stopping the Afghan government maintaining links that it did originally have with pockets of Taliban fighters around Afghanistan to create an environment where they could have that kind of discussion?
I think there's a couple of reasons why there's not any serious peace talks going on. I think we are now 15 years into the conflict. Groups have been opposing each other for many reasons. It's not only ideological anymore. It's also about money. It's also about power. There's a violent contest for power inside the Afghan government as well. Plus, it's also still very difficult for the US military, that is the most dominant in Afghanistan, is deciding on its policy to find a strategy for peace. I think in that sense, Obama, with its new plan, should have much more civilian input on this in the sense of a political roadmap to peace if they are really serious in this. I think it's not genuinely that they don't want to solve the conflict. It's just that they rely too much on the generals, while this is a process of peace. One major example is in 2001 when the President Karzai, at that time supported by the US forces, wanted to have the Taliban to surrender, and that happened in Kandahar. Big shots in the Taliban all walked over to Hamid Karzai and embraced the American presence in Afghanistan. They all wanted to have a better future. Already at that point, the US military said, no, we don't want to surrender. We want to fight the Taliban. The Taliban is our enemy. I do think that if you analyze the Taliban as an indigenous movement that is part of Afghanistan, it is now the time to really prioritize, also from the US State Department, a peace process and be very serious on this. Only then it can work, because the groups are so apart now, and the groups fighting each other, there's kleptocracy in Kabul. So it's very difficult to have a unity and to have a strategy on this. But that is the only solution.
Sharif Hussain, do you think that there is a political solution to the situation in Afghanistan?
I think there is no immediate political solution in Afghanistan. So that's why Afghan government and that's why Afghan people welcomed the President Obama's decision. So, I mean, without the presence of foreign troops, just assume that if there were no foreign troops in Kunduz city, I talked with a frontline commander and I told him that why they are not pushing the Taliban out of the city. And he told me that without American air support, it's impossible to push the Taliban out of the city. So it's a thing in immediate future, we need the NATO allies cooperation. Afghan government need them. But in long term, of course, no one, American taxpayers cannot pay forever for Afghan war. And of course, Afghans, are dying in unsustainable rate on daily basis. It's impossible for Afghans to, keep dying for a war forever. It's impossible. So there is need of a political solution. But for this political solution in the long term, there is need of genuine cooperation from Afghan government, as I said earlier, from the Taliban side and also from the Pakistan side.
David,
we know that they're in
Sharif,
the other side of the border.
Sorry to interrupt, we're
Pakistani,
actually running out of time. David, could I come to you very briefly for a final answer? Do you think that the US is prepared to be flexible in terms of the way that its attitude towards Afghanistan now, to perhaps allow a more political, a more discussive approach to the solution?
I think President Obama's reversal of his prior decision shows great flexibility. The U.S. has been supportive of peace talks and has worked for peace talks. The problem, of course, now is the Taliban think they can win the war on the ground. But is there a possibility for peace in the future? Yes. But right now, today, Afghanistan needs the kind of military help President Obama has put forward. In the future, the Afghans need to find a way towards peace. The United States is not the party to the conflict here. Afghans and Pakistan are the ones who have to find the way forward.
I'd like to thank all my guests for joining us today, Mohammed Hassan Sharif, Betta Dam and David Sedney. And of course, thank you to you for watching. As always, you can leave your comments on the programmes page of our website, aljazeera.com, and you can post your views on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or tweet us at AJ Inside Story. Thanks for watching. From me, Rob Matheson, and all the team here, bye for now.